All right, now we come to my favorite category. Everybody has a category of the 12 elements that seems to personally give them the most trouble. Some people have trouble with their composition, some people have trouble with their color harmony, and for me personally, it has got to be presentation. I struggle with presentation so often. So let's talk about presentation. And for those, if you don't understand exactly what we're talking about, presentation is the matting that you see around the image, the framing that you see around the image when the judges see the image. And it is one of the 12 elements. That's part of this image, is how you present it to the judges. So let's talk about this first image and the presentation here.
Yeah, and presentation is really kind of the icing on the cake. It's what holds us into that scene. And I'll start the conversation by saying, keep it simple for the most part. If you keep things simple, they're less distracting. If you try to get fancy, sometimes they fall in our face. So the more simple and basic, sometimes you keep things, the less it affects what you created within. In this particular case, though, they went with two colors that were within the scene. They had a very dark, low-key area that they chose for this portrait, and so they went with a dark outside border, and then they drew from some of the highlight within the scene as well, the red or burgundy-ish kind of screen there, and brought that in as a second matte. Now, a hint for you, if you're going to do something with very dark colors or blacks, please don't use black as your border. Rule of thumb. This is rule of thumb because we as humans compare things that are side by side. And if you're black, stark black, 00000, matte is competing with something in your scene that's not that same black, it'll make it actually look dull. Right. Rule of thumb is don't go stark black. Draw from the darkest part within that scene and use that as your matte color, so that's what's being compared from your presentation to your subject matter.
Because something in the scene that's black may not be pure black.
Correct.
And if you use a pure black for your presentation, now it's going to point out that, that's not pure black. And now you can tell it's not pure black.
Exactly. And sometimes then it can throw up red flags for technical excellence or things like that.
And if I can throw a tip in there, one of the things that you will hear judges say again and again and again is your borderline, you do not want that to pull the eye away from the image. So always be careful that borderline is not brighter, more stark, or and it pulls, because man, the judges immediately, they will notice that immediately. Your presentation has to complement your image and push everything towards your image. It's never about the presentation.
It's about it not distracting.
Yeah, it's about it not distracting. But at the same time, you can't just have always have just like, I'm just going to have a black background. Well, that doesn't always work either, or black, white. You have to have something. And this is why presentation can be so tricky, is you can't just go completely with nothing. And if you go with too much, that's a problem. So you got to find the right balance and the right color. So presentation, it's a tricky one. Let's look at another image real quick. All right, a great color harmony here with the presentation, right?
Yeah, it just fits. There's something else to note that it's best, in my opinion, to have a little bit of texture on the presentation, as opposed to just flat brown.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was probably 5 or 6 years in before I started using textured backgrounds, and I do think that they help.
It does. It just helps break things up, because there's nothing in a scene that's flat one color. There's always a combination of colors. And when we're pulling an eyedropper in Photoshop to create these mattes, you are specifying a single color. And what I do for texture even is I just put a little bit of noise in it and soften it, and put a little noise in it and soften it. It doesn't take much, just something to help break it up a little bit. But this is a good example of colors, how they drew the colors from in the scene. And I think there's something else to note, by the way. Be careful because a lot of people are like, oh, we'll just take an eyedropper and click on some place in the image and I know it's going to match. Well, not necessarily. You almost have to do this by eye, because if you use an eyedropper, again, you're taking maybe like a pixel
Right, a
that
pixel.
is one color, and it's not necessarily what our eyes saw of all those pixels around each other. So it's better to go by eye sometimes than just a specific eyedropper pull.
I think using textured stuff in your border also helps because it looks more the way a traditional portrait looks, which typically has some sort of a paper border. The mat is made out of some sort of paper or cardboard, and so it is not, like you said, a solid, perfect color uniform throughout the entire thing.
Oh, yes. And before you get to the next one, you just gave me a good idea, too. A lot of times we'll hear people put out a white mat, like a museum presentation. Like, well, that's what we use in an art gallery or in a museum gallery showing. And that's true. And some images work that way. But remember, we are evaluating an image for its own sake, not comparing to anything else. And when you're at a museum showing or an art gallery, generally you do that kind of white border because we're looking at a body of work that they all need to have some kind of continuity to them. There is no continuity here. It is an image that we're evaluating. And that's why sometimes a white museum quality type of presentation will work on an image, but it's not for everything.
All right, the next image is the other end of the spectrum. We were talking about, you can keep it extremely simple, sometimes too simple, and sometimes you can go much more elaborate. And it's dangerous if you go more elaborate, but if you pull it off, it's fantastic.
It can be, yeah. This torn edge kind of feel to this, and the colors. This is where all those other elements we were talking about, the color harmony and the composition, are tying together in this. So we have the rectangle with torn edges, and then it steps back with because it's like shadow mounted here. But then we have the roundness of all the other two rectangles. So it gives us the illusion that we're reaching into this scene before we even start reaching into the image. So their color palette, their color harmony, their composition with their presentation and their image together worked out extremely well.